All right, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on the body-worn camera policy, the scorecard, and certification. Before we get started, let me just go over a few details before we begin. Apologies for everyone that has heard this many times at this point. But my name is Carrie Shelton. I'm the Deputy Project Manager with BJ's Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. As a reminder, please keep your phones or computer audio on mute to avoid background noise unless asked to chime in with a question or some feedback. The session is recorded so that others can view it later on our website. If you have questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please do so through the chat function. You can send those at any time throughout the session. If you're using a computer, your chat function is located at the bottom center of your screen. If you're using a mobile device, it's in the top right corner of your screen. We do ask, if you haven't already done so, to please edit your display name by hovering over your name, clicking more, choosing the rename option, and changing your screen name to reflect your full name, title, and agency. And this just helps us make sure we know everyone that's attended the meeting and for grant reporting requirements. After the meeting, there will be an opportunity to evaluate it. Please do provide us your feedback as it helps us improve for future events. And finally, as a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you again for your participation in today's session. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our BWC TTA co-director, Dr. Michael White, to kick us off.
Thanks, Carrie. We should offer extra credit for those people who can recite those rules by heart. They've heard them so many times.
I know, sorry.
So thanks everyone for joining us. This session's focused on body-worn camera policy, and we're going to talk a bit about the scorecard and certification. But I think the most interesting piece of this session will be when we hear from the representatives of our TTA sites, Mark Smith and Inspector Ash, talking about their experiences, not only with the policy review process with this grant program, but specifically with some policy issues that they've wrestled with. They moved through the development and implementation of their program. So as Carrie mentioned, my name is Mike White. We have Charles Stevenson as well from CNA, who's going to offer some thoughts at the end, as well as I said, Mark Smith from Colorado Springs and Inspector Ash from the Wilmington, Delaware Police Department. So let's dive in. What I'm going to do for maybe 15 minutes or so is just lay a little bit of groundwork. I want to talk about why we think body-worn camera policy is important, why we think it's critical to the success of your program. And as a demonstration of that, I want to talk a little bit about activation compliance and highlight some of the things we know from research that's been done that demonstrate that policy is really a critical ingredient to what you're doing. And then I'll briefly move through the three main pieces of our policy review process for this grant funding program. That includes the scorecard, which you may be familiar with, the certification process, and then I'll whet your appetite a little bit with some policy analysis that we've done looking at actual trends. And then, like I said, I think the bread and butter then will be I'll turn it over to our site representatives in Charles, and they can talk about the experiences they've had. So let's jump in. And first, I want to talk a little bit, let's take a step back from body-worn camera policy and think about policy in general. And the importance of policy for police departments in terms of really being an effective way to guide and control police officer decision-making. And we have more than 50 years of research that's demonstrated that policy can be a really important, effective way to do that. We've seen that across a number of different types of officer field behavior, use of force, deadly force, pursuits, both auto and foot pursuits, canines, arrest behavior. So we've seen really across a large span of activities how important policy can be. But we also know from all this work that's been done that there are several conditions that have to be met if we can expect policy to deliver on the promise that we want it to have in terms of being that effective guide and control. And you see those on this slide. And the first, and this is regardless of whether it's a body-worn camera policy, a use of force policy, a pursuit policy, it doesn't matter. The first is that we need to make sure that the policy is clear. If you have a new policy that's come out on, say, use of force or body-worn cameras, and your officers are reading this policy, it has to be absolutely crystal clear what is expected of them, and what is not expected, or what is prohibited. So it has to be clear. The second, what I call precondition, is that the policy has to be known. And what I mean by that, the biggest disservice I think you can do to your officers if you have a new policy is just to have the sergeants hand it out at pre-shift roll calls and say, here, read this. this is our new use of force policy. Let me know if you have questions. That's just not the way to do it. You need to make sure the policy is known and understood. You can, train on the policy. You can even do scenario-based training, and that can be especially useful with use of force or pursuits, or especially body-worn cameras if you're thinking about activation and those kinds of things. And then the third piece, and perhaps the most important piece, is that the policy has to be enforced. We heard a lot over the last 2 days about monitoring compliance. Officers need to understand that if they violate policy, they're going to be asked about it. They're going to be asked to explain what happened. Maybe that leads to discipline, maybe it doesn't. But the bottom line is that there has to be this expectation that there's a policy in place. The policy is clear, it's known, it's understood. And if I, as an officer violate that policy, I'm going to be asked to explain exactly what happened. So if these conditions are met, then we can expect, yes, policy is going to effectively guide and control our officers' decision-making. Now let's move specifically to body-worn camera policy and why we think it's important. And there are a couple of things on this slide that I think are worth highlighting. The first is that you can use your policy to communicate the goals of your program. So why is it you've decided to go down this road? Why have you decided to have your officers wear cameras? You can state in the beginning of your policy what your goals are, and then you're communicating those goals not only to the officers that you're asking to wear these cameras, but also to others externally. Certainly, you're going to convey your expectations to officers on very specific things like activation, like citizen notification, like when they're going to be able to review their own footage. Also, we talk a lot in this program about policy development, and the policy development process is an excellent opportunity to be collaborative. Certainly, Charles and I do most of the reviews of the scorecards that come in, and we're always looking for, a policy development process that is internally collaborative. That is, you've engaged all the relevant folks in your agency as you're developing policy. That would include a union if you have one, first line supervisors, people who are in IT or records, making sure all those folks are at the table. And then also, externally, who do you need to kind of have looped in at the table? Certainly prosecutors would seem to be an excellent resource to have involved from the start. And this course allows for transparency as you're developing your policy. And a good policy then, of course, is going to tell officers, it's going to guide their decision-making on any number of things like activation, like when they notify, like when they can review footage. And then, of course, it provides that foundation for accountability. So those are the highlights, I think, of why body-worn camera policy is important. If you were in I think it was the Tuesday session, the past, present, and future session that we did, I talked a lot about what the research is telling us. And the bottom line is that there's a robust body of evidence that says that body-worn cameras can deliver on a number of outcomes that are really core to what you're trying to do as a police department. They hold great promise. They have tremendous evidentiary value. They can lead to reductions in complaints against your officers and reductions in use of force. It's a way to enhance legitimacy and improve transparency. But the bottom line is that all of those benefits get short-circuited if your officers are not compliant with the policy. And I thought what I'd do is just spend a minute or two talking about activation as a demonstration of this point. What you see on this slide is activation compliance rates by month. And this is from Phoenix. This is from a long time ago. If you look at the bottom, it's 2013 and 14. Phoenix was one of the first departments to engage with researchers on the rollout of their cameras, and they started small. This study involved, I think, 55 or so officers in one precinct. But what you see here is the monthly activation compliance rate. And you can see it peaks in May of 2013 at 42% and then drops off after that. Overall, throughout this entire period, the compliance rate was about 30%, which isn't very good. That means about 70% of the time when officers by policy should have been activating, they didn't. If you were on the DEM session yesterday, you heard Professor Chuck Katz talking about recent work that he's been doing with Phoenix, and that compliance rate has come way up. It's in the 80% neighborhood now, but a good demonstration of how things can go poorly in this regard. Next slide. A couple other examples. The Mesa, Arizona Police Department, they did a year-long study, and they started off their study with a very restrictive activation policy, basically saying officers had to record everything. And then 6 months in, they loosened it a bit. They gave officers more discretion in terms of activation. And then after the year-long study was done, they went back, and what they saw was pretty shocking to them. When they moved to that less restrictive policy, activations declined precipitously by 42%. And then there was another study by Barack Ariel that actually linked compliance with policy to use of force. When officers followed policy, that is, they activated when they were supposed to, and they notified citizens of that activation, use of force declined by 37%. And when officers did not follow one or both of those policies on activation and notifying citizens, use of force actually increased considerably. So some really good examples here of how compliance with policy is linked to some of the outcomes that we're focused on. I like to use this slide because when we think about activation compliance, oftentimes we think about that at the department level. What's your compliance rate for everyone? And what this slide shows is that you can think about compliance at the individual officer level. So this is from a study I did in Spokane, and each one of these dots represents a police officer. It shows the compliance rate for each of those officers. Don't worry about the colors. It was rolled out in 2 phases. But basically what you see here is you had a chunk of officers that had a 0% compliance rate, meaning they were never turning the camera on. And then you can see how it kind of tracks up. And then you had some officers who were approaching 80% in their compliance rate. And I've seen this kind of line created for a number of different departments. The point being here that you're going to have low activators, you're going to have medium activators, and you're going to have high activators. You're going to want to know, especially who the low activators are, so that you can work with them to get that rate up. And, ideally you would have a straight line. You wouldn't have a slope line. You'd have a line that went all the way across at 70%, 80%, whatever your target rate was for compliance. I do like to show this slide. I borrowed this from a couple of years ago at this meeting from New Orleans. They were presenting. This shows their compliance rate, and you can see it is exceptionally high, typically at 95% or above, showing that it can be done. Now, the context here is that at the time, New Orleans PD was under a consent decree. They had a federal judge who was hyper-focused on activation compliance, which then led to these very high rates. The bottom line here is I wanted to use compliance with activation as an example of why we think policy is so important and why compliance with policy is going to be crucial to the success of your body-worn camera program. Let's transition a bit now and talk about some of the key elements of the policy review process that you're going to go through with this grant. And as you heard both yesterday and this morning, there are some requirements with regard to policy for this grant. As you can see from that first bullet, you're required to implement a policy that's comprehensive, deliberate, and considerate of broad stakeholder input. As you know, there's a special condition. You can't access 90% of your funds till you go through this process, submit your policy, have it approved, and then BJA releases the condition and you get the rest of your funds. So it's critically important. There are 2 ways then that you can do this, that you can move through this process, clear the special condition, and get full access to your funds. And I'm going to talk briefly about both of these. First, I'll talk about the policy review scorecard process that we've developed and have used over the last 7 years. Over the last couple of years, we've developed an alternative to that, a self-certification form. I'll talk about that as well. This is reserved for agencies that perhaps they've been funded through this program before, so they've gone through the policy review process or have been doing this for a long time and have a well-established policy. So it's an expedited approach. But let's talk first about the policy review scorecard process. And this is the process that Charles and I are intimately involved in. I can't tell you how many policies I've read or scorecards I've read, way too many for any one person. The way this is set up is you submit a draft policy to the TTA folks that you're working with. It's a collaborative process back and forth. I'll show you the scorecard in a second, but you're probably familiar with it. The scorecard is designed to rate the comprehensiveness of your policy. This is not an adversarial process. This is we're here to help. Your team is helping you to get your policy through these hoops, make sure everything's covered in policy so that you can, as I said, remove that special condition and get rolling with your program. The scorecard, which you see here, we've developed over the years. It's not fancy. It's an Excel spreadsheet. It's publicly available on the TTA website. And essentially what it does is it rates BWC policy across 9 different areas, 36 specific issues. On this slide here, you see the policy development area and you see the specific issues that are there, and it's a check the box, yes, if it's covered. You'll notice that some are in red. There actually are 13 items or issues that are in red, and those are the mandatory ones. Those are the ones that BJA has determined are of such critical importance. They absolutely have to be addressed in your policy. The most important takeaway here with regard to the scorecard and this review process is that it's designed to make sure that your policy is comprehensive, but it's not prescriptive or directional. BJA, CNA, ASU, we're not telling you what you have to say in your policy. You decide the specifics of the language. The review process is just to make sure that the policy covers all the bases. So the example that I've used for years that demonstrates this point really well, I think, is notification of citizens about recording. So what does your policy tell your officers about that citizen notification? It's a mandatory item. It's in red on the scorecard. And there are a couple of ways that can be addressed. So first, you may decide that you want citizen notification to be mandatory. So your policy will say to the officers, you shall notify citizens that they're being recorded. That's great. That gets a check mark on the yes, done. But many agencies decide they don't want to make that a mandatory statement. So you can have language that says, we recommend that you do the notification to citizens, but it's not required. That's great. That's fine too. That also gets a check. Or you may simply say you're not required to notify citizens that they're being recorded. Also fine. Three very different ways to address a mandatory item on the scorecard. So that's what I mean when I say it's comprehensive. We're saying in the scorecard or in this review process, you need to have something in policy about citizen notification, but you, the agency, you decide locally what you want that policy language to be. Next slide. This is the certification form. As I mentioned, this was developed a couple of years ago as we started to get grantees who either have been doing this for a really long time or, as I said, maybe been funded already through this program. It's an expedited process. All of the nuts and bolts are essentially the same, except you, the agency, your executive team is certifying that the mandatory issues are covered and that your policy is consistent with all of the requirements that are in the scorecard process. You certify that, you submit the form with your policy, and you move through very quickly. I mentioned the 9 different areas. Here are the 9 areas that are covered in the scorecard. I had mentioned this on Tuesday. Our mantra, our kind of philosophy is a good, comprehensive body-worn camera policy is going to lead to good body-worn camera practice. Next slide. So the last couple of things I want to mention before I turn it over to my co-presenters, because the scorecard is not prescriptive, we see variation. So we see variation in, say, citizen notification in terms of what agencies decide to do on whether it's mandatory or not. And because there is that variation in policies, one of the things we've been doing for years is conducting a policy analysis. That is looking at the policies of agencies that come through this program and looking at trends. And here you see the link to the most recent version of this report. We're up to about 450 policies that we've analyzed. In this report, you can look and see what trends are. We've got, I think, 11 different policy areas that we look at. We've identified nearly 24 trends. And if you look at the next slide, you can see the different areas where we are examining it. So if you want to know what agencies are saying, for example, on when officers can review, or when footage has to be released after a critical incident, you can go to this report and find out what's the common trend. What are most agencies doing on these issues? Next slide. Here are the different issues that are examined in the report. And like I said, we've identified about 22 or 23 different policy trends. And I thought what I'd do before I kick it to Mark Smith is just real quickly whet your appetite and show you the kind of things that we're looking at in this report. So in this next slide, what you see is actually the percentage of agencies that have gone that route with citizen notification and said it's mandatory. And there are all sorts of bar charts in the report that look exactly like this, where we're analyzing a trend over the years of being funded. So for example, what you see here is it's pretty uncommon for agencies in this funding program to have that mandatory notification. Over the years, it's about 20%. Which means about 80% of agencies have taken the route of some example language you see at the bottom that it's not mandatory. So that's one example of a trend. One other example, next slide, I thought might be interesting for you to take a quick look at. So this is about critical incident review. What happens when one of your officers is involved in a shooting and it's captured on body-worn camera? Your officer is going to have to make a statement, but what is the sequence of events there in terms of making the statement and reviewing footage? And this is a hotly debated and contested issue, and I've heard good arguments on both sides. But what you see here is that, at least in the early years of this funding program, it was very, very common for agencies to allow their officers to watch the footage first. and then make a statement. Very similar, or an example you see is a policy language at the bottom. Prior to writing a report, they're allowed to look at the MVR. But this is an example of a trend that's been changing recently. You can see how that drops off fairly significantly the last 2 years. So it's becoming increasingly common for departments to require that statement to occur first, then review the footage. And I think Assistant Chief Hall from Tucson in the Voices from the Field talked about how they've taken that position in their agency. That is, I think that's it. The final thing I'll say before I turn it over to Mark is that local context matters. And what is going to work policy-wise for Sturgis, Michigan may not work for Colorado Springs or Wilmington, Delaware. So there's no one size fits all. The other thing to keep in mind is that policy is going to change. The policy that you have now is going to evolve and be modified, I don't know, every 6 months, every year, based on the new issues that are occurring. And the last piece is, as many of you know, state legislative bodies are now passing laws that they may mandate body-worn cameras, and in some cases, they get very nitty-gritty into some of the specifics, such as retention or when video should be released or what's going to happen if an officer doesn't activate on time. You need to make sure that the policy that you have is completely in compliance with those state laws that are changing. So I think that's plenty for me. That's a lot of talking for me. Let's turn it over to our co-presenters. And I think Mark's going to go first and talk about some of the issues that Colorado Springs has been dealing with.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take about 10 minutes to talk about actually a couple of the issues Mike just touched on in his presentation that have really impacted us here in Colorado Springs as we developed our policy. First is the impact of legislative mandates on our policy, and second is how we've dealt with that critical issue of officers viewing body-worn camera footage that is connected to either internal investigations or critical incidents like officer-involved shootings. I'll pause for just a second to say we were funded by BJA back in 2016 when we started our body-worn camera program and went through the policy review process at that time. And earlier this year, we went through the self-certification process as part of this project. And I'll just say what a straightforward, quick process that was. And if you're eligible for it, I'd highly recommend that you look at doing the self-certification process. And I was very happy that we had the opportunity to do that through BJA. Our state law here in Colorado that goes into effect in 2023 mandates that body-worn cameras be provided to peace officers who interact with the public. So that's pretty much everybody from the chief on down. And there is no exception for officers wearing plain clothes, although there is an exception for officers functioning in an undercover capacity. As examples, I want to discuss two aspects of our policy that we've wrestled with here in Colorado Springs that are impacted by the changes in our state law. Number one is the requirement around when officers must activate their cameras. And this is an area where we've worked to tighten up our policy through various versions over the years. Honestly, we were a little too optimistic when we first wrote our policy in 2016 and soon discovered that the cameras weren't being activated when they should have been on a more frequent basis than we would have liked. And I know that's a theme we've kind of heard this week. Mike just touched on it. In fact, if I recall correctly, I think we had a couple of deadly force incidents where the officers' cameras weren't activated. So as a result, we made activation requirements more explicit in our current policy in order to give less discretion about when cameras have to be turned on. And again, I know it's a theme we've heard throughout the week, but policy really does matter in this respect. So in retrospect, I'd suggest that agencies be specific about activation requirements when you are first developing your policy. Doing so might help you avoid some of the problems we encountered here in Colorado Springs. Of course, now here in Colorado, activation requirements have been set by state law. And here's what it says. Officers are required to activate their body-worn camera when responding to a call for service, entering into a premise for the purpose of enforcing the law, or in response to a call for service, during a welfare check, except for a motorist assist, or during any interaction with the public initiated by the peace officer, whether consensual or non-consensual, for the purpose of enforcing the law or investigating possible violations of the law. So as you can see, it's not the most clear-cut language you've ever heard, and there certainly isn't much wiggle room for leaving your body-worn camera turned off. More than that, the consequences for failing to activate a body-worn camera as required by the law are potentially severe. Failure to activate creates what our state law calls a rebuttable presumption of inadmissibility. This means any statements or conduct that would have been introduced in court through the officer are presumed to be inadmissible. So if an officer fails to activate their camera and then witnesses, for example, an assault, the officer may not be able to testify about what they saw. The only exception is if there was an equipment malfunction, and that exception only applies if the officer can show that they checked the functionality of their equipment at the start of the shift. There is no exception for an in-progress emergency. For example, if an officer bailed out of their car to intervene in some type of a crime in progress and forgot to activate their body-worn camera, the officer will likely not be able to testify about their actions or observations. They would not be able to testify because our law says that if the camera was not activated, there is a permissive inference of misconduct. In other words, the law presumes that the reason the camera was not activated is because the officer was engaged in misconduct. As you can imagine, this could have a real impact on victims and the success of prosecution if our officers aren't allowed to testify about their actions and observations. I'll just add that if it can be shown that an officer here in Colorado intentionally failed to activate their camera, they can potentially face the loss of their peace officer certification for a minimum of 1 year. And under certain circumstances, if it's demonstrated that they intentionally did not activate their camera, they can lose their peace officer certification permanently. I'll also mention that our new state law has some very specific requirements around the release of body-worn camera footage in certain situations. To say the least, it's complicated and it's not particularly well written. The specifics of the law around body-worn camera footage release here in Colorado aren't really applicable to other parts of the country, but I'll just say that it's been a real challenge to write policy that's in compliance with our state law when we can't even get the lawyers to agree about what the requirements are. One of the things we've done to try to successfully navigate the release process is to form an internal committee that meets regularly to make decisions about release. This group consists of people including a deputy chief, our legal advisor, body-worn camera evidence technicians, representatives from our victim advocacy unit, our legislative liaison, and our records manager. I should note that we actually formed this group prior to our recent state law being enacted because we wanted to make sure we were considering the relevant issues prior to releasing footage in situations that might be more complicated than normal. Implementing an internal group who can collectively make decisions about the release of body-worn camera footage is an idea I think is worth considering, even if you don't have a complicated state law like the one we're trying to comply with here in Colorado. I'll add that if other agencies are dealing with a situation like we are here in Colorado, I think it's imperative that departments put measures in place to make sure your officers truly understand your policy, and Mike touched on this as well. With the serious consequences our officers potentially face for violating our state law or our policy, we simply need to insist that they have a true working knowledge of both. The fact that the law may be difficult to interpret doesn't relieve us from formulating a workable policy and ensuring that officers know how to apply it. I'd like to wrap up by just talking about how our policy lands with respect to authorized viewing by officers of body-worn camera footage connected to internal investigations and deadly force incidents. This is an area of our policy that, frankly, back in 2016, we probably didn't flesh out as well as we should have, and we've made a lot of revisions to it since then. Obviously, it's a big issue to the cops, and there are a lot of competing arguments for and against officers being allowed to review their body-worn camera footage in these situations. One of the common arguments I hear from officers is the process should be about accuracy and about the truth, as opposed to being some type of a test of an officer's memory. While I generally agree with that statement, it isn't always that clear cut. Our basic policy is that officers can watch their body-worn camera footage to prepare reports, to testify in court, for investigative purposes, for training, or for what have you. But there are two exceptions: complaints and internal investigations, and deadly force incidents like an officer-involved shooting. With respect to internal investigations and complaints, normally our officers are allowed to watch their body-worn camera footage prior to being interviewed. However, the supervisor conducting the investigation may elect to jointly view the footage with the officer as part of the investigation process. In rare circumstances, viewing by the officer may be prohibited, but that requires authorization of a deputy chief or of the commander of our investigations division. Deadly force incidents are treated differently in our policy. The default position of our policy in deadly force incidents is that officers are prohibited from viewing the video prior to being interviewed. Our position is that officers' recollection and perception of events are key elements in this type of an investigation. But we also recognize that it's well established that the nature of these incidents can impact an officer's ability to accurately perceive events. We've all heard about tunnel vision, distorted sensory perception, hearing impairment, etc. So the other general component of our policy is that officers may be allowed to view their body-worn camera footage in a deadly force incident after their initial interview. Our policy also mandates that if an officer is permitted to view their body-worn camera footage The interview will continue so that the officer can state any clarifications they may choose to make. For example, I remember one of our officer-involved shootings that occurred inside the garage of a residence. And the garage had 2 overhead doors, but the officer said in their statement that the garage had 1 door. After he was shown what the house looked like, the officer stated that although they only remembered 1 door, it was pretty obvious that the house had 2 garage doors. That's just one simple example of how that clarification process might work. I think our policy's aim was to try to strike a balance between alleviating concerns that the interview is designed to trap the officer when something they say may not exactly match what is shown on their body-worn camera. But on the other hand, what an officer perceived at the time they made the decision to use deadly force is a critical component of the investigation. And we need to know what those perceptions were prior to the officer watching the body-worn camera footage. If there are things that the officer doesn't remember or didn't perceive accurately, then basically, I think it is what it is. And there are plenty of reasonable explanations why an officer's recollection may differ from the body-worn camera footage. Of course, all of this is premised on the fact that the officer elects to be interviewed in the first place. Since a deadly force investigation is potentially criminal in nature, officers can decline to be interviewed as part of a criminal process. In our department, that does not apply if there is a subsequent administrative investigation. So my closing point on this topic is don't paint yourself into a policy corner if you can avoid it. These types of investigations are typically complex and it's virtually impossible to anticipate every scenario you might encounter. So I'd suggest having provisions in your policy that allow deviations from it under specific circumstances that might arise. So I think I'll end there and I'll turn it over to Inspector Ash for her thoughts.
Thanks so much, Mark. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Inspector Cecilia Ash. I am the Inspector of Operations here at Wilmington Police Department in Wilmington, Delaware. First, I'd like to thank BGA and CNA for the opportunity to speak at events like this. I think it's important, but keeping in mind that I am merely a representation of the great work that the men and women here at Wilmington Police do, especially our technical resource unit that handles our body-worn camera process. These are made up of 1 sergeant and 3 officers. When selecting them for this project, I made sure that they're well respected amongst the officers, and even some of them are part of the FOP board. So, just giving a balanced approach really can help with the confidence of the officers. So overall, Wilmington Police is a medium-sized agency. We are 312 officers. Everyone in our department, from the chief down, wears a body-worn camera. And that's really to emphasize leadership and that we are not going to do anything that, we wouldn't expect our officers to do. So we want to have that reflection of leadership from the chief down. So we do have the whole entire department is outfitted with body-worn cameras. And we started our pilot program here in 2016. To Michael's point, we have year to date about 13 citizen complaints, where at this same time last year, we had 29. What has been significant for us is also not just transparency with the community, but I'm a big proponent of transparency with officers. And with that, what we do is once a month, I have the lieutenant from our professional standards or internal affairs division go down and address roll calls to let the officers know how many of those complaints were cleared without even having to interview the officer because of false statements made by the community. Here in the state of Delaware, we do have Officer Bill of Rights, which requires us to serve an officer with notification of rights before interviewing them. So for example, we have 13 complaints thus far this year, which is phenomenal. But of those 13, 7 have been cleared just merely reviewing the body-worn cameras. So that really emphasizes and echoes the support that we get from our officers in the department. We were able, after the certification of our policy, to deploy our body-worn cameras within 30 days of receiving them, which again just echoes the hard work of Corporal Pierce and other people within our TRU unit. With that, ironically, we deployed and finished our training on June 1st. That evening, we made national headlines when we had 3 officers shot. So all three officers were wearing body-worn cameras at the time of the incident, and it was captured on camera. So it really just emphasizes the importance to these officers. Luckily, all three officers survived, and our last one just returned this month back to the job. So we're very blessed for that. So just going into some of the process that I experienced and that Wilmington Police experienced through the scorecard process, we really found that it was very flexible, flexible state to state, and the understanding from our TTA providers that there are some guidelines here in Wilmington or in the state of Delaware that are not applicable to maybe their policies or recommendations. One would be we are a one-party consent state. We do, to Mark's point and to Michael's point, encourage our officers to disclose that they're being recorded, but again, it is not mandatory for our officers. Also was the flexibility around the laws and our applicable policies around retention, around media releases. We have certain policies that, with the department in light of our media, where it was flexible with the TTA provider and the evaluators of the policy, that there were some standards that we were going to struggle to meet. Really, what was important for us was engaging our stakeholders, the prosecutors that were going to be affected by this case, the community, but really important to me was the FOP. Our Fraternal Order of Police, and getting the police officers' perspective and really giving them the opportunity to talk about what were they worried about. So when we worked collaboratively with those stakeholders, I think that helped us getting the certification process done very quickly. Again, after our deployment, and giving the policy to the TTA provider, within weeks, we were approved. So, honestly speaking, going into it, I was worried that this was going to be a typical federal government red tape process where we're going to take months. And we were under so much pressure from our community, in light of everything happening across the country. And even our legislators, a month after we deployed our body-worn cameras, made it law here in the state of Delaware that every police officer must wear a camera. So we were under a lot of pressure from our community, but I really found that, the benefit of that scorecard also was not only the quick process and them getting us, the money quickly, but really from an executive perspective is sitting there and being able to tell your community, being able to tell your council and elected officials, this isn't just a police policy. This is a policy that has been reviewed at a national level by other civilians and researchers and experts in this field. So it's not just us writing our own policy, trying to protect our own. This is a policy that is national best practice. I think also just giving examples of the flexibility, we have to understand that with body-worn cameras, to Mark's point, there has to be flexibility. You have to be prepared that you are going to have to change this policy frequently. One, because of the technology, but two, just because of the different things that we discover. I think as we went into this program, we thought we knew what we were doing, and honestly, we figured out that we didn't. One of those areas where we had to drastically improve was in our auditing process. We are now capable of auditing all 312 officers every 2 weeks. And again, that really just echoes the work of the unit for our technical resource unit and what they do. And the way that we do that is we audit first the officers' CAD calls for service in comparison to their activations of their body-worn camera. And then also what we do is we ensure that we are auditing their tagging process as well, because that is very crucial here in the state of Delaware, because we do have retention laws here in the state of Delaware. But really, when we found that officers were making some of these mistakes, it's really about the emphasis of train, train, train. This isn't an I gotcha moment. That's not what we're here for. But there needs to be accountability. And so I go by the 3 principles, and I explain to everyone: fair, firm, and consistent in everything that we do. As a leader, putting out this policy and this program, I found that attending as an executive, second in charge of this police department, attending every single training And the reason why is because it gave the officers the opportunity to pose questions about the policy or interpretations directly to the people who are going to be evaluating discipline or having a say. So it really gives them the opportunity to get the answer from the top, and also addressing immediate issues or concerns, or maybe even some misunderstandings or misrepresentations of the policy. Things that we also changed within our policy was our buffering. We started off, like most agencies, at 30 seconds. We are now at the maximum of 2 minutes. And really the response to that is we are in an urban setting where our officers, are pulling guns off of people and in foot pursuits. And sometimes they don't have the ability until they're effecting the arrest to activate the cameras. And the officers have been receptive to that, which I was shocked at, because they know what they're doing is legal and ethical. We do review our policy every 6 months, but we also keep in mind with the development of technology and laws that it's important to maintain national best practice. Sometimes we're going to have to institute changes in those policies immediately. I think really the last point is, what are the challenges that we faced as an agency? One of the biggest challenges that we faced in the beginning was people saying, why can't you just put the cameras on and go? And it's not that easy. And it's very difficult to get the community to understand the complications of the technology and everything else. I would encourage, if I had to do it again, I would probably ask our elected officials to put on a body-worn camera for a week and see how many mistakes they make in failing to activate, or what conversations they don't want recorded. But that's just my private thought. But in closing, my one piece of advice, and what I end all of my training sessions with our technical resource unit is, just telling the officers, if ever in doubt, record it out. And I'll give it back to you from there, Michael. Thank you.
Charles, do you have any parting thoughts? We got a couple of minutes
a
left.
minute or two, and I just maybe say some. I'll say something briefly about policy, and then talk about the scorecard a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions. I think by now everybody, as far as an agency's policy, you've realized it's a cornerstone of your program. Developing a well-written, comprehensive program is essential to program success. The good thing out there is there's hundreds of examples that you can draw from. Since 2015, we've worked with hundreds of agencies. There are hundreds more out there on the internet that are easily accessible. So you shouldn't have to try to reinvent your policy. Review half dozen or a dozen policies. See what others in your local area have written and developed. Whether you're a state, municipality, Department of Corrections, there are examples out there. You have a TTA team signed to you. Ask the team to provide you some example policies. Ask them specific questions, specific answers. Usually when I'm working with the department, if they ask about a question, I'll give them at least 3 different examples of how a department handled an issue. So it shouldn't be a overly difficult process to develop a comprehensive policy. There's plenty out there to draw from. As far as the scorecard, and I give Mike a lot of credit for this. The scorecard hasn't changed much since 2015. We've added a couple new issues to it. We've removed a couple issues, but it really hasn't changed. Those 13 mandatory issues we find on every policy. Not that they're mandatory, but they're on policies. If you go look at non-grantee policies, you'll find those same 13 within a policy. So it's a very good guideline. It's not hard to do. As far as the process, once you submit your policy, your team has followed up with a policy review call, and you went back and forth, and it's ready to submit. The actual submission time is quite quick. It normally is handled within a week or two, and you'll have notification. I will say this, what you'll get back from BJ is an email notification that they've told your assigned state policy advisor to remove the special conditions. I encourage everyone to save that email. Your site team will send that to you once they get notified that your policy has been approved. With that said, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'd kind of like to open it up for questions.
And Charles, just so that you know, I did post my information, and to your point, I posted our policy, which is public. So that link is in the chat as well.
Mike, we must be doing a good job. There's not much.
We left them speechless.
Yeah, we sure did.
I see that Carrie just put the link to the latest edition of the policy analysis in the chat. So if you wanted to take a look, you can just click on that link. And what do you think, Carrie? Should we wrap it up?
Carrie, there was a question, and Carrie put this: what happens if you change your policy? Once your policy is approved by BJA, unless you get a follow-on grant, it never has to go through the process again. We do ask, if you do change your policy, that you provide the TTA team the most recent version of your policy. For one, Mike conducts his research on it, so we really would like to have the most recent one, so we can track changes in why you've changed your policy and which direction the law enforcement community is going with policies. Please don't think once it's approved by BJ, it's approved.
Hey, Charles, this is John. First of all, great session. I was torn between this one and the digital evidence integration, but I chose this one. And we've been at this for a while, but very well done. I thought I knew everything about this process, but I think I learned more each time. And I think that the trend analysis is useful to calibrate where you're at with other agencies and with national trends. To both Mark and Cecilia, really great presentations. I think it really hit home on how this needs to be individualized. So I think things came together. And I will just, on Charles's comments, is we, as was said by others in preceding sessions, that the policy should be revisited if your state law changes, but just as the technology changes, as conditions change, as research changes. So we encourage you to, change your policy. And basically the goal was to be comprehensive and deliberate. So once you hit that mark, we're confident that you're only looking to improve it, not retract and become less comprehensive and less deliberate. So great job.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Very informative. And as our presenters have mentioned, if you need any assistance with your policy, any questions about things you might want to add later on, etc., we're happy to address those with you. And actually, I'm seeing a question come in the chat right now, so I'll read that. I don't know who wants to address it. So the question is there any research on remote location activation if a policy mandates activation? There have been discussions about requiring activation upon dispatch. However, if a trooper is dispatched and it takes 2 days to travel to a remote village, they can't record 2 days of footage. We had to consider that when writing a policy on requiring activation, but being clear enough to allow the time separation between call dispatch to arrival on scene. So any research on remote location activation for mandated activation?
I'm not aware of any that has specifically looked at that. That seems to be, certainly an extreme example. I can tell you just from all of the policies I've read over the years that it has been much more common to say to require activation upon arrival at scene. It's really only been the last 2 to 3 years where I've seen increasingly